There was a time when music wasn't just something you listened to. It was something you lived through. 1 year, one sound, and suddenly the whole world shifted. If you remember even a piece of it, this journey is for you. They called him the Master, and they meant it. When the Beatles met Fats Domino in New Orleans in 1964, it wasn't just a friendly handshake. It was the British invasion bowing before one of rock and roll's true architects. Years later, Paul McCartney wrote Lady Madonna as a quiet tribute to Fat's unmistakable piano style. Moments like this remind us where the real foundations were laid. And speaking of young musicians learning from the pioneers, the next generation was already finding its voice. Here's Chuck Berry arriving in London in 1964, greeted like a king. Every young band in the city, the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, had learned his riffs long before they ever shook his hand. This wasn't just a tour. It was a coronation for the man who shaped the sound of an entire movement. And as Chuck stepped onto British soil, another band was discovering the spark that would soon define them. Keith Richards and Brian Jones in Florida, 1964. Back when Brian was the leader and Keith was still finding his footing. That same week, Keith woke up in a hotel room with the opening riff to Satisfaction playing in his head. A sleepy idea that would change rock forever. The Stones were reinventing themselves in real time, just like another young musician fighting a much more personal battle. A young Eric Clapton sits beside the woman he believed was his mother, though she was actually his grandmother, the one who raised him. The truth about his real parents would haunt him for decades, shaping the raw honesty in his playing. Behind the fame and talent was a kid searching for identity. And while Clapton was sorting through his past, the Beatles were forced to navigate a future none of them were prepared for. Miami, 1964. The Beatles didn't want to meet the loudmouthed young boxer named Cassius Clay, and Clay teased them right back. But the photos from that day became iconic, capturing two forces on the edge of worldwide domination. 1 week later, Clay became Muhammad Ali. The Beatles became America's obsession. And just like that, the world had two new kings. But Ali wasn't the only powerhouse the British bands would collide with that year. Here's the Rolling Stones meeting James Brown at the TAMI show in 1964. The Stones had to follow Brown's performance, a career mistake they joked about for decades. Brown didn't perform that night. He erupted, and the Stones understood exactly what level they'd need to reach. It was a humbling moment, and it helped forge bonds inside the band that would last a lifetime. Keith Richards and Charlie Watts in 1964. The heartbeat and the engine of the Rolling Stones. Charlie didn't just keep time, he shaped it, driving the band with the calm precision that kept their chaos from spiraling. Their partnership was quiet but unbreakable. And while the Stones tightened their sound, the folk world was on the verge of its own earthquake. Bob Dylan in Paris, 1964. Sitting in a cafe where Napoleon once played chess. Dylan loved the game not for the tactics, but for the symbolism. Every move led somewhere new, and he was already planning his next one. Soon he would plug in an electric guitar and shock the folk scene to its core. But before that transformation, there was someone who understood him better than anyone. Joan Baez and Bob Dylan in New York, 1964. They look close, But this was the twilight of their romance. Baez had lifted Dylan into the spotlight. Now he was outgrowing the world they built together. Their partnership was ending, personally and musically, just as the entire culture was beginning to shift. And that shift was nowhere louder than inside the eye of Beatlemania. Lennon and Harrison on the set of A Hard Day's Night, 1964. The world saw their charm and humor. They felt the exhaustion behind it. Beatlemania was crushing, relentless, and they survived it by laughing their way through the chaos. The film captured their spirit better than any documentary ever would, even as the pressure around them only grew. Ringo Starr on a private beach in Miami, 1964. Or as private as fame allowed. Surrounded by police, chased by screaming fans, this was the closest thing the Beatles got to a moment of peace. Beatlemania had turned everyday life into a security drill, but every now and then, they still managed to feel like kids again. Here it is. The Beatles' legendary pillow fight in Paris, 1964. They had just learned I Want to Hold Your Hand hit #1 in America. This wasn't staged. It was pure joy, the release of 4 young men realizing they had just conquered the world. It was a fleeting moment of innocence before the spotlight shifted to America's own rising stars. The Beach Boys on The Ed Sullivan Show, 1964. They were clean-cut, confident, and on top of the world. But within months, Brian Wilson would step off the touring circuit and retreat into the studio, beginning the journey toward Pet Sounds. It was the calm before one of the greatest creative storms in American music. And across the ocean, another storm was gathering around a band that was about to redefine rebellion. The Rolling Stones in 1964, back when Brian Jones was the clear leader. His vision shaped their early sound, raw, blues-driven, unapologetic. This photo captures the moment before the Jagger-Richards songwriting partnership took over and rewrote the band's destiny. And that destiny would soon stretch far beyond London. The Stones again, defiant and dangerous. The anti-Beatles. This image didn't just document their look, it created it. London was full of clean-cut pop groups, but the Stones were different. They didn't smile for the camera, and people loved them for it. Meanwhile, the Beatles proved they could do more than charm an audience. The Beatles on Ready, Steady, Go in 1964. No lip-syncing, no backing tracks, just raw performance, the kind that silenced critics and electrified crowds. This was the proof that the Beatles weren't a studio creation. They were a force. And as 1964 came to a close, the world realized this wasn't a passing trend. It was the beginning of something much bigger. 1964 wasn't just another year. It was the spark. The moment when rock and roll grew teeth, grew heart, and found its voice. The legends were young, the world was wide open, and the soundtrack of an entire generation had only just begun. If these memories brought you back, wait until you see what came next.